Welcome into Real Pod Wednesdays. I'm Dan Hope, joined by Andy Anders. We spent last week's show recapping the national championship season, talking about all the great things that happened on Ohio State's run to a national championship. So now on this week's show, we're going to start looking ahead to the 2025 season and taking a look at Ohio State's roster for the 2025 season, because the Buckeyes do know now what their roster will look like, at least for the spring. The transfer portal is now closed. Ohio State able to fend off some efforts to get some of its top players into the portal, trying to entice them with $1 million offers. Ohio State ultimately fending off those efforts, really losing only one player in the final days before the transfer portal closed, that being defensive tackle Hero Kanu. And so Ohio State did a good job keeping its roster intact for the spring. And now we can really kind of look through this roster and have an idea of what the 2025 Buckeyes are going to look like.
For a few days there, it seemed like there was a chance that some players were maybe going to get picked off from Ohio State through, some combination tampering in the portal. There was all that stuff around Carnell Tate getting big offers, Jeremiah Smith getting big offers to go different places. But ultimately, those key pieces stuck with the Buckeyes. Plus, you return Davison, Igbinosun, and Sonny Styles, who both had NFL draft stock but decided to come back. So overall, in terms of retention, fantastic week coming off of the national title for Ohio State, when there were times, you might have had some doubts about that. Maybe they were going to lose a guy or two here or there. Nothing that was going to cripple the entire program, especially when you're coming off a national title. But it was good to see for Ohio State to see them retain those pieces that they were planning to have for next year. And I think that's the first step. I mean, when you talk about what this past year's team was, one of the key elements was the ability to retain so many seniors, and that's what kind of sparked the run. Obviously didn't have the opportunity to do that this year because all those now seniors made up the majority of your key positions, your starting spots, and they're all gone now because they have to be, and because they have great NFL draft stock too. But for the pieces that you were looking to retain, that you, I think, were planning on retaining, to keep all of that in the fold, I think was the first step in terms of building a successful roster for next season.
It's going to be an interesting build up to the 2025 season because, like you mentioned, Ohio State does not have nearly as much returning, experienced, proven players in the lineup as it did a year ago. If you talk in terms of guys who were full-time starters this past season, you're only going to have three on each side of the ball. On defense, you have Caleb Downs, Sonny Styles, and Davison Igbinosun. On offense, you have Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, and Tegra Shabola. Now, you have a couple other interior offensive linemen in there, Luke Montgomery, Carson Hinsman, who started in the CFP, and so they could sort of be considered returning starters, but they weren't full-year returning starters. And so, when we get to the interior offensive line portion of this, that's certainly going to be an interesting position because of the fact that you really have four guys coming back that started games this past season. You obviously have, two wide receivers coming back to lead that group who started all year this past year. And as mentioned, you have those three guys on defense who were starters this past year who you're now going to look to be leaders for the team next season. But everywhere else, you're going to be breaking in a lot of new players. And, that's going to make this a different looking kind of off season than it was last year, because I think last year we kind of came out of, even just, January, February with some of the pieces they added. You kind of went into spring feeling like we had a pretty good idea of who the starters were going to be at just about every position. We might be able to have some ideas at a lot of those positions going into this spring, but there's going to be more real competitions out there because of the fact that a lot of the players they're going to be counting on to play bigger roles this year are guys who are very talented players who have been in the program but have not played the kind of roles yet that they're going to be asked to play in 2025.
Absolutely. I think that's what's going to make this spring so interesting. Last year there were a few position battles. Will Howard had to cement himself as the Ohio State quarterback and obviously didn't officially win that job until the fall. But I just think this year, last year it was more about like seeing all the pieces out there, all the talent, how it's going to fit together, all these guys you have coming back, adding some stars in the portal with a couple position competitions. Like you said, I think it's going to be more across the board in this one, but it starts right back at quarterback. Julian Sayin has that 5-star hype. I think a lot of people would consider him the front runner to be the quarterback this fall in Columbus. But look, Lincoln Kienholz, he's a fantastic athlete with a great background, has an extra year in the system, has, I think, been positively praised by coaches at certain points. He could make this a competition, and you have a 5-star freshman coming in who's an Ohio kid who is a massive riser through his time in recruiting to become a 5-star prospect in Tavian St. Clair. And so those three names, like say it might be the odds-on favorite, but I do think there's a situation where Lincoln Kienholz and even Tavian St. Clair get involved in a little bit of a quarterback competition here this offseason.
I would be surprised if Julian Sayin doesn't ultimately emerge as the starter, but I don't think that he's a lock to be a starter as people might think. And I think when you start hearing the talk about a quarterback competition this spring, I think there's probably going to be a lot of skepticism out there. A lot of people who think, oh, it's a done deal. They're just going to keep this competition open for, trying to keep everybody happy. But, they ultimately know Julian's going to be the starting quarterback. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think Julian still has to go earn this job. I think Julian has to prove some things in the spring, in preseason camp, to show that he's ready to be the starting quarterback, because he obviously didn't play a lot this past season. I think, the times he did play, granted, it was with backups, so we didn't really get to see the full Julian Sayin at any point in his freshman year. But, he had some ups and downs in those experiences. I think that he showed Ohio State a lot of good things in his first year, but, maybe there's some things that they still want to see him develop on. Obviously the size remains a question mark with him. But I think, all the tools are there for Julian Sayin to be great. But when you start seeing stuff on social media about, oh, this guy, he's going to be the best Ohio State quarterback ever. Like he's going to be better than Justin Fields and CJ Stroud and all that. I'm like, okay, let's pump the brakes a little bit. Let's see how he does this offseason. Let's see how he does when the actual games begin before we start talking about him that way. Is the potential there? Yes. But I think that there's still more things that he needs to prove this spring and fall. And, something we're obviously going to have to keep in mind because of what we saw this past season is we can't overreact to how he does in the spring, whether good or bad, because, you and I both had a lot of reservations about Will Howard last spring, and he ended up being exactly the quarterback this Ohio State team needed and led Ohio State to a national championship. And the good thing with this new college football playoff format is they don't necessarily need Julian Sayin to be CJ Stroud from day one. They need him to be really good at the end of the season. But there's some time for him to grow, for him to develop into that role if he ultimately ends up being the starting quarterback. But I think for that quarterback room as a whole, I think you feel pretty good about where this quarterback room is going into the season. You have 3 talented guys in there, like you mentioned, in Julian, Lincoln, and Tavian. It's a different situation than a year ago where you're not going to be bringing in a transfer to come in and start. Whoever that starting quarterback is going to be a guy that's never started a collegiate game before. So you have to expect some growing pains there at the start of a season for whoever it might end up being. But I think they do have 3 guys they feel really good about. The important thing is, can they keep all 3 of those guys? Can you keep everything on track going into preseason camp? Because you are slightly under where you'd like to be in terms of depth. I think you'd like to have one more scholarship quarterback in there. And I think that if a Tristan Gebbia, Gunnar Hoke, Chris Chugunov type guy was to enter the portal, I think Ohio State would look to add that kind of guy to bring in kind of a veteran quarterback to be a backup, to be a mentor for those guys. The right guy who actually is willing and wants to take on that role has to enter the portal. but I do think that's something Ohio State will try to add to its roster. And certainly, if say, Julian Sayin was to separate himself from a competition and Lincoln Keenholz was to look elsewhere after spring practice, then Ohio State would be in a position where it would have to add another quarterback. But I think right now, the hope is you're going to have all three of those guys and that, Lincoln is going to, be a part of that competition. We know he's going to be at least a part of that competition for the spring, and then we'll see where things go from there.
On that note, I do think you're probably going to want to look at that veteran transfer to be that Jebbia Chugunov type. If you lose another one after the spring practice, like you said, just because you need to have three guys ready to go, I think, in that quarterback room just for the sake of depth. If things go wrong, things go haywire, whatever. Harder and harder to find those guys these days. I think as more players want that NIL money, want that starting opportunity, it's become in recent years maybe harder to find that third string, but Ohio State's been able to do it multiple times in the Ryan Day era. And if you need that guy after spring practice, if you lose somebody, I think that's when you consider going out and getting them. For now, I think you can be fine with the three quarterbacks you have. Just for depth purposes, I fully expect the first half of the season to be a bit of a up and down tumultuous thing for whoever that quarterback ends up being. I mean, even with the greats, right? It wasn't like CJ Stroud was just CJ Stroud from day one. He struggled at that beginning of that 2021 season. And I think that there were even calls at that time for Kyle McCord to get another shot at the starting job, right? That early 2021, it took some time for things to click for CJ. I think Will Howard was much better at the end of the year than he was at the start of the year this year, playing in a new system. It's going to take time for whoever that quarterback is to click. And the good news, like you said, 12-team playoff, you have time. Ohio State can afford to lose that first game to Texas. It's okay because you have the rest of the season to make up for it. As long as you're not dropping 3 games in total, you're going to be in the playoff pretty much every time if you're Ohio State. And there are even years where 9-3 could potentially get it done. So you have that maneuverability now with the expanded playoff. Jumping to running back, though, I think is in an interesting spot now that Quinshon Judkins has officially declared for the NFL draft, and Travion Henderson's obviously was a senior this year. He'll be drafted in the NFL draft, we expect. But I really like James Peoples and think while C.J. Donaldson was a good add for depth, there are some things he's going to give the offense, I think, especially in short yardage situations, maybe more of that power type. I think James Peoples could emerge as a star next year. I really like his skill set. He reminds me some of J.K. Dobbins, just that kind of a really hard-nosed runner. He constantly finishes his runs physically, but also kind of a leaner body type with a little more burst and cutting ability, those really good jump cuts that JK kind of had. Got some reps in certain situations this year. Those faded as Ohio State wanted to lean more on its star tandem as the year went on. But I would expect a big year 2 from James Peoples, and I wouldn't say don't totally write off that Bo Jackson or even Anthony Turbo Rogers can get involved here, because to me, running back is the one position in college football, especially where you can make an impact year one. And we've seen it multiple times in recent Ohio State history, whether it was Dobbins, whether it was Travion Henderson, those guys having big freshman seasons. Not to say that there isn't development that happens at running back, and development isn't important for a running back, but it's one of the least developmental positions in football in terms of time to see the field, time to make an impact. If you've got those athletic traits, develop the vision, learn the offense, and then you're kind of good to go at the running back position in terms of making that impact. So I think there's a lot to be excited about with James Peoples, but C.J. Donaldson was also a very nice add in terms of that depth and taking some reps off of, both the other bodies in that running back room. And I'll be interested to see exactly what the rotation between those guys looks like.
Yeah, as we saw this past season, it doesn't really matter who the starter is between those two guys, because Ohio State is going to be hoping it plays another 16, 17 game season, which means that it's going to need to rotate multiple running backs to keep those guys fresh. So I think much like we saw with Travion and Quinshon, I would expect we're going to see James Peoples and C.J. Donaldson in a rotation throughout the year. And, neither of those guys is Travion or Quinshawn. I mean, neither of those guys is coming in as an established star like Ohio State had two of them going into last year. But I do agree with you that I think James Peoples has a lot of upside. I think CJ Donaldson is going to be a good, big physical power back, maybe kind of at, Carlos Hyde, Mayan Williams type of back for this Ohio State offense. And so I wouldn't project that Ohio State is going to be elite at running back in 2025 like it was in 2024. But I think it can certainly still be very good with the duo of James Peoples and CJ Donaldson. And then, like you mentioned, I think that door is open for one of those freshman running backs, whether that be Bo Jackson or Turbo Rogers or Isaiah West. I think that door is open because of the fact that James Peoples is the only returning running back on the roster who played it all last season. So the door is open for one of those freshmen to come in. I think you would like to have one more running back on the roster who had a little bit of experience. You'd feel a little better about your depth in that case. But to your point, I think running back is a position. It's not like offensive line where I think freshmen can come in and contribute. So I think the fact that you have those three running backs in the 2025 recruiting class, I think you feel pretty good about where you're at running back. It's not quite as good as you felt going into last year when you had Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. But I think, running back, I wouldn't necessarily look at it right now and say it's a surefire strength for this team, but I don't necessarily view it as a weakness either, because I think that the pieces are there for Ohio State to be pretty good at running back. When you talk about surefire strengths for this roster, wide receiver has been a surefire strength for Ohio State pretty much since Brian Hartline took over the wide receiver room. And it certainly looks like it's going to be again in 2025, because there was a little drama this past week with, Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, both reportedly getting, lucrative offers to enter the transfer portal. I don't think there was ever any concern with Jeremiah. I do think there was legitimate concern with Carnell Tate. I know that, some people out there, see those reports and think, people were just trying to start stuff. There was never any doubt. I do think there was a little bit of doubt within the program at times last week about whether Carnell Tate was going to stay at Ohio State. But ultimately, Carnell Tate is staying at Ohio State. Jeremiah Smith is staying at Ohio State. Brandon Inniss is staying at Ohio State. And I certainly think that's going to be the best wide receiver trio in the country in 2025, continuing a 5, 6, 7 year run here of Ohio State having the best wide receiver room in the country. And you add in guys like Bryson Rogers and Mylan Graham, some talented freshmen led by Quincy Porter coming in. This wide receiver room continues to be in very, very healthy shape.
Yeah, not much more to say other than that, Dan. I mean, it's automatic with Brian Hartline these days. You expect Ohio State to have the best receiver room in the country, and I think Jeremiah Smith could prove to be the best player in college football regardless of position next year. I think we're both expecting that kind of season from him, because even as good as he was in year one, there's always a year 1 to year 2 leap, regardless of how extraordinary a talent you are. I do think you're going to see an even bigger season from Jeremiah next year. And put up some numbers that are pretty eye-popping there. But Carnell Tate, I mean, you talk about having more than 700 yards receiving as the number 3 receiver on your team. Carnell had an awesome season, quietly in parts, but really in that playoff run, especially against Texas, had some really big moments for Ohio State. And that's why he got so much attention in the portal, why teams were willing to come up with those offers that, were reportedly exceeding $1 million, right? Like really big NIL offers coming after Carnell. And like, there's a reason for it. People respect what Brian Hartline has done with this room. And I think Brandon Inniss has shown you enough flashes. He got involved in a few spots in the game plan, and he has that 5-star talent. I think it was going to take a little longer with Brandon than with Carnell or Jeremiah, because he played, quarterback in high school and it did some other things that maybe not getting as quickly that development as the others, but he definitely showed plenty of flashes this year, and I think you put him in the slot with Jeremiah and Carnell on the outside. He's got that shifty, explosive burst that I think is going to suit him really well, and it emerges a true weapon in the offense next year alongside those two guys. So yeah, it's just more riches, more great play at receiver for Ohio State. And I really like the depth too. I think Bryson Rogers could be sneakily pretty solid off the bench next year. Mylan Graham, I'm really excited to see the jump he takes in year two. Coming out of Indiana, he was going to take some time to develop too. But he has he was a 5-star prospect for a reason. He has the tools, lightning fast. I'll be excited to see exactly where he progresses coming into next year. And even, like you said, Quincy Porter could get some reps in year one, or at least get some looks. Ohio State's receivers room, you really just can't put too much praise on those guys. They've been the best in college football for half a decade and are going to be the best in college football once again moving into 2025. But where Ohio State, I think, you talk about the passing game, you talk about weapons, Max Clare, and this tight end room could be a really low-key strength for Ohio State in 2025. And Max Clare, when you look at what he did at Purdue, 51 receptions, 685 yards, and 4 touchdowns. And then, lest you forget, Purdue was a really bad team last year. And for a tight end, as a tight end to put up 700 yards as the team's leading receiver, that's the main threat on their offense. I think it speaks volumes to Max Clare's talent, and you mix that weapon in with the receivers that you have. Pretty fun to think about the ways that could open up the passing game for Ohio State. Not that G. Scott didn't have a few key catches throughout the year, but I really think you haven't seen a receiving threat like this. Well, I guess since Kate Stover in 2023 did break some tight end records for Ohio State, but you could see something in that caliber of a season, or even bigger, I think, for Max Clare, just the skill set he's bringing in. I really liked how Bennett Christian developed throughout the year, and I think his blocking is a real weapon, but the same to Will Kasmerick and Jelani Thurman, Max LeBlanc. There's a lot of depth, and there's going to be a lot of competition for even those top 3 tight end spots, top 2 tight end spots to get involved in the offense for this room, because there's a lot of depth and a lot of, frankly, talent that Ohio State's going to have at tight end next year.
I've been on the Ohio State beat since 2017, and I'm about to say a sentence I've never said before. Ohio State could have the best tight end room in the country in 2025. I think it's that good. Max Clare is one of the best pass-catching tight ends in the country. Will Kasmerick, he was really good in the college ball playoff. I think you really saw him come into his own late in the season, make a big impact for the Buckeyes as a blocker. I think he could be one of the best blocking tight ends in the country. Bennett Christian, to your point, I think is one of those guys who really didn't get a lot of attention, but I think was also really good as a blocker. Hasn't shown a lot as a pass catcher. That's an area of his game he needs to develop to earn more consistent playing time. But I think as a blocker in some of those 2 and 3 tight end sets, he was a real weapon for him. And then, Jelani Thurman's a guy as well that, going into his 3rd year, you would think that he's a guy who should be able to make a jump and become a contributor for this Ohio State offense. And then, even a guy like Nate Roberts coming in as a freshman, you don't usually see freshmen play much at tight end at Ohio State, but he's a guy who, seems to be more ready than the typical freshman to potentially contribute. I don't know how much they're going to need him to contribute in 2025, but I think the top end talent of this tight end room is excellent. And I think the depth of this tight end room is excellent. And so I think this is the best tight end room that Ohio State has had in a long time. And I think you talk about strengths for this team. I think the tight end room is absolutely going to be up there in terms of strengths for the 2025 Ohio State football team. The offensive line, of course, is a position that has been one of the most heavily discussed and scrutinized positions for Ohio State over the last couple of seasons. And I think, I think I go into 2025 feeling better about the offensive line than I did going into the last couple of years, because I think Ohio State made two quality transfer portal additions to fill its need at tackle, bringing in Igbinosun from Rice and Philip Daniels from Minnesota. And then we mentioned it before on the interior offensive line. You've got four guys coming back with starting experience on that interior offensive line, and Luke Montgomery, Tegra Shabola, Austin Sierveld, and Carson Hinsman. Plus, you've got a guy like a Joshua Padilla, who you'd think would also be more ready to contribute in year 3, has shown some flashes in limited action. And so I feel pretty optimistic about Ohio State's offensive line going into the 2025 season. Replacing some big pieces for sure. Losing Donovan Jackson. Obviously they lost Josh Simmons and Seth McLaughlin during the 2024 season, but those are still, big losses from your room. Josh Fryer, another veteran leader. So, there's going to be questions at all 5 spots, like whether it's new guys or returning guys. Those new guys have to prove that they're Ohio State caliber starting offensive tackles. Those returning interior offensive linemen, you're banking on more development from all of them because they weren't necessarily dominant in the college football playoff. They were good enough. But I think the growth you saw from those interior offensive linemen in the college football playoff gives me optimism about what all of them can become with another year of development, and then pairing them with those incoming tackles coming in. You also have a guy like Ian Moore going into his second year at tackle, who I think is going to be, is going to at least push and try to make that, right tackle competition with Philip Daniels interesting as well. And so, maybe you'd like a little bit more veteran offensive tackle depth. Maybe you'd like to have someone on the interior offensive line who's a bit more of a sure thing with a, full season of really high caliber play under his belt. But I think all in all, I think the pieces are there for Ohio State to have a good offensive line in 2025.
Yeah, and look, I think honestly, Justin Fry, what he did this past year, what he did even his first year in 2022, I think he's proven now that as a developer, you can criticize his recruiting, although, like you said, the transfer portal has to factor into that. I think you get credit for landing those 2 tackles in the transfer portal. But, there's been some recruiting misses. As a developer, I don't have any doubts about Justin Fry anymore. Like, you look at what he did with this year's offensive line, Donovan Jackson sliding out to left tackle and becoming one of the best tackles in college football, like when he hadn't played it all of his college career. You look at what happened on the interior, multiple shuffles you had there, and doing enough to go on a national title run. I think Justin Fry has the pieces when you look at the board, what Ohio State has at each of those 5 positions. And I think you feel confident about Justin Fry getting that unit where it needs to be. Now, it might take some time to coalesce and click. I think we saw that at different points with the Ohio State offensive line this year. It took them a game or 2 to figure it out. It felt like after each key injury, whether that was Josh Simmons and then you had Sid Mahalski before Donovan Jackson slid out to left tackle, Seth McLaughlin, what happened. They didn't really have a good offensive line game against Indiana. What happened against Michigan happened, and then you have a great run through the playoffs for the offensive line. But to me, I think the other thing, to your point, that gives me confidence is I think Luke Montgomery is going to be a stud next year and maybe emerge as one of the best guards in the country, at least in the Big Ten. What he did in the playoff, as far as he's always had a great athletic background, and I think it started to show in the playoff, but just that mean streak, saw him pancaking dudes, knocking off multiple bodies in pass protection. Luke took massive strides over the course of his sophomore season, and I think he has the toolbox to be a truly elite left guard for this offensive line. And Carson Hinsman was one of the most improved players on Ohio State's team, I think, from the middle of the season onward, because when he first had to move back to center after the Seth McLaughlin injury, he struggled for a little bit. He had a couple of bad games, especially snaps were an issue for a little bit, but he really course corrected and had a very nice playoff run. I think those 2 pieces, whoever wins that right guard competition that I think will emerge between Tegra Shabola and Austin Sierveld, with Shabola as a bit of the incumbent, but they rotated obviously in this college football playoff. you feel good about. You feel really good about that interior, and then you're going to have that extra depth piece. Whoever loses that competition, assuming they stay at Ohio State at right guard, is going to be a really nice extra depth piece to have on the inside. And I even think Josh Padilla coming into year 3 for him could be a nice backup option at center, and Hinsman has the ability to move out to guard if need be. The tackle conversation, Ethan Onyanwa is going to be you talk about 34 starts of experience. That's exactly the kind of anchor you need at left tackle. And I think, he'll clearly have that position from day one. Phillip Daniels, he doesn't have as much experience. And so it's going to take some time to figure out what you have in him. Maybe have that competition, like you said, with Ian Moore. After those two, and maybe Ian, though, I think you do get concerned with tackle depth. Ian Moore, again, entering year 2, year 2 is kind of this weird time for an offensive lineman. You don't know if it's always going to click that early because the position is so developmental. I think Ian Moore's a good talent, but how far along is he going to be in his development? And then, beyond him, it's not a whole lot of options at offensive tackle for Ohio State. Deontay Armstrong is coming back, but that's really kind of it because you lost Zen Mahalski and George Fitzpatrick in the transfer portal. So if you get an injury there, you're all of a sudden feeling really shaky about offensive tackle if you're Ohio State. So maybe even looking at another, it might be hard to find a depth option at tackle in the portal, but it's going to be important for those younger guys, Ian Moore and Deontay Armstrong, to develop and be ready to go if the number is called this season, because, just saw it, offensive line injuries can happen and do happen frequently.
Now, the other side of the line, I think, is probably one of the bigger question mark positions going into 2025, because Ohio State, of course, has to replace all 4 of its starting defensive linemen from this past season: Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Ty Hamilton, and Tyleik Williams. And we didn't see as much rotation on the defensive line this past season as we thought we might. Now, some of that had to just do with the fact that those 4 starters were really, really good. I mean, the way Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau were playing in the CFP, it was hard to take those guys off the field. As disruptive as Ty Hamilton and Tyleik Williams were in the middle, it was hard to take those guys off the field. But they are really counting on a group of guys who have primarily been backups at Ohio State to now take that leap forward here in 2025 and lead the defensive line. I think on the end, Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson are 2 guys you looked at. They've really been waiting their turn. I mean, if Jack and JT had gone to the NFL a year ago, as they could have, they probably would have been starting a year ago. Now, going into their 4th year, they both look like they, could finally have that opportunity to step up there at defensive end. Ohio State also bringing in Logan George from Idaho State, which I think is an intriguing addition, because you're talking about a guy who had 19 and a half tackles for loss last season at the FCS level. So it is a jump, but I think the skill set and the tools are there for him to at least be a productive rotational player at defensive end for the Buckeyes. And then really the wild card on the edge is CJ Hicks, because for one, we don't know what the scheme's even going to look like next year, because Ohio State doesn't have a defensive coordinator right now. Maybe by next week's episode, we'll have some more clarity on that, and I'll be able to talk a little bit more about that. But until Ohio State replaces Jim Knowles, we're just kind of guessing at what the scheme could look like next year. But I think there's certainly been a school of thought that CJ Hicks is going to move into an edge rusher role next season. Will that mean playing the jack position or whatever a hybrid outside linebacker position might be called by whoever Ohio State's defensive coordinator is in 2025? Could that mean just bulking up and playing defensive end? We'll see, but I do believe it's most likely that CJ Hicks is going to be an edge rusher next year. Quite frankly, I think if Ohio State didn't tell CJ Hicks he could be an edge rusher, he might not still be on the roster at this point, because I think he's made it clear to Ohio State that he wants to play that edge rusher role going into his senior year. And so I think at defensive end, I look at some combination of those 4 guys leading the way. And I think there's a lot of upside in that group. Nobody who's proven like you had in Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau going into last season. But I think certainly, that quartet gives you the potential to have a really good edge rotation in 2025.
Right, and Kenyatta and Caden both at least logged a good number of defensive snaps the last couple of seasons, backing up Jack and JT, and I think showed flashes in their own respective ways. Caden Gurry even got involved in some specialist pass rush packages as a 3 technique, so there's different things you can do with him. And speaking of which, that 3 technique competition is going to be interesting to see if Edric Houston can emerge as the guy at that spot for Ohio State after kind of, he was clearly Tyleik Williams' backup by the end of the season at that 3-tech spot after moving inside from defensive end as a freshman where he was recruited. And now you roll him in with a chance to put on more weight. Some of the competition that would have been at that 3-technique spot left Ohio State in the portal when Hero Kadu transferred. But you still have Jason Moore there. You still have a Taiwan Malone, even a Will Smith Jr. Does Edric Houston quickly cement himself as the number 1 guy? And I think that would lend credence to maybe a nice little breakout season for him as a sophomore. At nose guard, I think it's Caden McDonald time. Played the 3rd most snaps of Ohio State's defensive tackles this year. The combination of size and first step and burst is something that might be a little unique. As good as Ty Hamilton was the past couple of years and was a fantastic block eater with a lot of strength, I think Caden's skill set is a little bit unique to what Ohio State has had recently at that nose guard position and could be really effective in a defense if he takes proper steps to prepare to be that number 1 guy. And I think his conditioning is something that's got to be worked on too. When you talk about having starter reps in that big of a body, those are kind of some key, I think, trends to watch on the interior of Ohio State's defensive line. And you have pieces there that could provide you some depth. We'll see how all those guys develop, because I think we saw when Tyleik Williams went down, it wasn't necessarily the best look at 3 technique. This was kind of before Edric got involved, but still, you need those guys, some guys to take steps and provide that defensive tackle depth behind who, I would certainly pick Caden McDonald at nose guard, and we think probably Edric Houston that 3-tech, but we'll see if guys can get involved in the competition there. Stepping back to linebacker, with or without CJ Hicks involved in that, and like you said, it's hard to predict exactly where he's going to fit in this scheme without a scheme because there's no defensive coordinator. I think the combination of Sonny Styles and Arvell Reese as those 2 linebackers, if it is still that 4-2-5 structure with Arvell at the mic and Sonny at the will, is something you feel really good about. Arvell flashed tremendously in 2024. It felt like was a key piece when they wanted to go 4-3 packages. His athleticism, his instincts, we saw. And this is a guy, he was recruited as kind of that tweener defensive end linebacker. Like, they settled on a position for him. He gets downhill, gets attacking, and you get a really nice piece going into year 3 now with some experience under his belt at that linebacker spot. And Sonny Styles, we talked about him being the most improved player on Ohio State's defense over the course of the season, was phenomenal in the playoffs, I thought, other than getting burnt on one wheel route against Texas. Was all over the field, ended up with 100 tackles, a weapon on the blitz, super athletic, really instinctual from playing that safety position. I think he's going to be a star for Ohio State next year. And I think you feel really good, not just about those top 2 guys, but the depth at linebacker is solid too, with some younger guys coming up and some really exciting freshmen coming in.
Yeah, I think Peyton Pierce is a guy who probably is going to be in line to be that number 3 linebacker next season. We heard James Laurinaitis really talk Peyton Pierce up this past year, even though he missed spring practice with an injury, was a guy who was able to start working his way up the depth chart quickly, showed them he could play both of those inside linebacker positions. So I think he's probably the likely guy to be the first linebacker off the bench behind that Sonny Styles, Arvell Reese combination, which I agree with you. I think you feel really good about going into 2025. And then, you talk about those freshmen coming in, Riley Pettijohn, a very highly touted recruit, Tarvis Alford as well. I think those are both guys who have the potential to push for immediate spots on the 2 deep. An interesting transfer as well, and Ty Howard coming from Duquesne, a guy who didn't get as much attention when he transferred to Ohio State as the other guys they got, but was a really productive player. Again, like Logan George at the FCS level, so we'll see. Does that materialize into real playing time? Is he going to be more like a Joey Velasquez was last year, where he's more of a special teams / depth guy? We'll see on that, but I think, looking at the roster as a whole, 9 linebackers on scholarship, if you include CJ Hicks, even without him, if he moves to, the edge, you've still got 8 guys on scholarship, a lot of talent in that group. Not a ton of experience behind Sonny and Arvell, but I think the upside of that position group, you feel really good about it being one of the stronger position groups on a rebuilding defense for next season. Cornerback, another position group that continues to look really strong, with Davison Igbinosun making the decision to stay at Ohio State for his senior season. Certainly, we expect Jermaine Matthews Jr. To step into a full-time starting role in 2025 after, playing that third cornerback role this past season behind Igbinosun and Denzel Burke. It's certainly his time to be a starter next year. I think probably the biggest question mark position would be that nickel spot in the cornerback group. But I think Lorenzo Styles Jr. is a guy who's been developing toward being that starting nickel next year. And so he's likely to be that guy. And I think we've seen enough flashes from him to make you think that with another year of development, he's capable of stepping in there and being that replacement for Jordan Hancock. And then you've got some really promising first and second year guys as well. I mean, Devin Sanchez is a guy who I think has the talent to play right away as a freshman. I don't necessarily think he'll be a starter because of Davison Igbinosun coming back, but I could absolutely see him being that number 3 cornerback and getting real snaps in the rotation, just like Jermaine Matthews Jr. did this past season. And then, the second year guys as well, particularly Aaron Scott Jr. and Bryce West. Those are 2 other guys who have a lot of upside. I think Bryce West is a guy who could potentially factor into that nickel rotation. And then I think Aaron Scott's another guy who has, future starter potential on the outside, maybe not in 2025, but I think, if you have a 2 deep on the outside of, Davison Igbinosun and Jermaine Matthews as your starters and Aaron Scott and Devin Sanchez as your backups, I think you feel really good about that.
Yeah. Those 2 starting, I mean, Jermaine's had excellent tape coming off the bench in that third cornerback role, I think. There's reason to have a lot of confidence in him being that starter alongside Davison. And if Davison cuts his penalties in half, might be one of the best corners in college football. I mean, the penalties were like the biggest thing holding him back from that sort of elite All-American status. The nickel competition is going to be interesting. Lorenzo Styles Jr. does seem to be that odds-on favorite with the experience he got in the dime back role, the amount of reps he's gotten. He seemed to have been groomed to be that guy to replace Jordan Hancock when the time comes. But, you have so much talent behind, again, Davison Igbinosun and Jermaine Matthews at that cornerback position, that outside cornerback position, that you maybe wonder, with Ohio State's tendency the last few years to put a cornerback at that nickel role, if someone can maybe challenge, whether that's Bryce West or Aaron Scott Jr., maybe challenge Lorenzo for that spot. And if not, I do think Devin Sanchez is going to be too good to keep off the field in year 1. I don't know exactly how they're going to get him involved, but I think you're going to see him by the end of the year at some point get reps in moments where it counts, be it as the third cornerback, be it even as the fourth cornerback or something. He has, to me, he's not quite the same as Jeremiah Smith was in terms of being that generational receiver prospect that was like the number 1 receiver, not just in this class, but like for however many classes before, but he's pretty darn close. I think he's, like I said, he's going to be too good to completely keep off the field in his freshman year, despite a pretty deep and talented cornerback room, even if it's inexperienced and young, outside of Davison Igbinosun and a little bit of Jermaine Matthews. You drop back to safety, and of course you have the best safety in college football returning, Caleb Downs. That always helps, but the position competition to start next to him is going to be one of the more interesting this offseason. And we've talked about a lot of interesting position competitions, but Jaylen McClain, I think, surprised a lot of people as a freshman, just how far along he was, be it in the spring game, losing his black stripe quickly, he made plays in fall practice, like emerging even ahead of a Keenan Nelson Jr. who transferred in from South Carolina, and some of the, more veteran names, even a walk-on like Brenton Inky Jones, in that safety room quickly. You wonder if he can give Malik Hartford a competition next year when it's looked like recently Malik's job after Lathan Ransom ultimately departed. And so whoever starts at that safety spot, and it's likely going to boil down to those two, is going to have the best player in college, one of the best defenders in college football playing next to him all season, and that's going to be very helpful for development. But it is still a really important spot in the defense, whatever the exact structure is, that second deep safety position. And so Malik Hartford has gotten some experience, but not a ton over the last few years. You wonder how much of a push Jaylen McClain can give him, and how it's going to mix in with Downs, whose versatility too allows you to keep a pretty open door in terms of skill set for who can fill that spot, because Caleb could be your deep safety, he can be your strong safety, he can be in the box, he can play that 12 yards off the ball, middle of the field role he was playing. There's so much Caleb Downs can do, and that also helps open the door to whoever the best player is. We can make the skill set work because we have this other piece back deep at safety.
And you could absolutely see situations, too, where Caleb Downs, Jaylen McClain, and Malik Hartford are all on the field. I mean, you think about when Jim Knowles came in, it was really a free safety defense. And we saw a lot of that in the second half of this past season with Jordan Hancock playing a lot of that safety role. Even though he was, termed a cornerback, he played a lot of safety in the second half of the season. So I think there could be opportunities for both of those guys to play a lot. I tend to think Jaylen McClain is the more natural fit for that true strong safety role, if you assume Caleb Downs is going to be the primary free safety. But we saw them move Caleb Downs around so much last season that they're going to want to continue to use Caleb in a lot of different ways. So I think, it could be somewhat of a rotation, somewhat situationally, to where, you've got Caleb Downs playing in the middle field, playing closer to the line of scrimmage. You might want Malik Hartford to be more of that guy who's playing that deep free safety spot, as we saw Jordan Hancock play in a lot of those situations. Whereas I think Jaylen McClain is probably the better fit in terms of being that strong safety downhill hitter in the box, like we saw Lathan Ransom play. So it'll be interesting to see. Again, a lot of it's going to depend on who's the defensive coordinator, what schematic tweaks do they want to make in terms of how those guys are utilized. I tend to think both of them are going to have roles in this defense, though, of course, with Caleb Downs leading the way. And I think you feel pretty good about the depth at safety as well. As you mentioned, Keenan Nelson Jr. coming back for a second year with the Buckeyes. Leroy Roker's a guy that I think Ohio State is very high on his upside, even though he was not a particularly highly touted recruit. And then you've got another trio of freshmen in there, led by Fahim Delane, who I think is certainly the kind of guy who has the potential to come in like a Jaylen McClain did last year and really start to make a name for himself early as a freshman. So again, it's another one of those positions where maybe you'd like to have like one more veteran with a little more experience. But I think if the young talent, the less experienced guys, sometimes you use that word young, like Malik Hartford's the same age as Caleb Downs. Like they're in the same class. It's like we don't think of Caleb Downs as a young player because he's already been a starter at the collegiate level for 2 years. But, it's inexperienced guys. You need at least one other guy outside of Caleb Downs to really cement himself as a starting caliber player. I think ideally you're hoping that both Malik Hartford and Jaylen McClain do that, so that you have free safeties you really trust. And then I think you've got a solid group of guys. Like you said, even throwing an Inky Jones in there, even though he's a walk-on, with how much he's played on special teams, I think you've got a solid core of guys there at that safety position. But you feel pretty good about what you have. Of course, starting with the fact that you have Caleb Downs coming back. Rounding out with the specialists, Ohio State does bring back all three of its starting specialists from this past season: Jaden Fielding, Joe McGuire, John Furlman. I think, coming out of a Michigan game, maybe after a Tennessee game, there was more thought of Ohio State's going to have to go get a transfer kicker. I think some of that's kind of faded because of how well Jaden Fielding played in the rest of the CFP, going 4 for 4 on field goals in Ohio State's final 3 games, including a pair of 46-yarders. Getting a lot of love from Pat McAfee on those alternate broadcasts for his kickoffs. And so I think Jaden Fielding did what he needed to do in that CFP to put himself back in position to be Ohio State's starting kicker next year, though I think you'd still probably like to see Ohio State bring in a transfer kicker with some experience just for depth purposes, because as of right now, Jaden Fielding is the only kicker returning from last season. So they're going to need to bring in another kicker one way or another, whether it be a transfer or, a walk-on from the high school ranks. I'd probably look to bring in somebody who has some experience kicking elsewhere just to give Jaden Fielding that competition and to give yourself another option at kicker who's actually done some kicking at the collegiate level. Punting could be interesting as well because you have a guy in Nick McLarty who's on scholarship, who Ryan Day said a week before the season last year he was going to be their starting punter, and then they made a late about face there, went with Joe McGuire. He ended up being the starting punter all year long. We saw it in practice sessions with Nick McLarty. I mean, this is a guy who's got a booming leg, but was just too inconsistent. There, one punt, he'll uncork 170 yards, and then the next one, he'll shank it off the side of his foot. And so I think if Nick McLarty can find some consistency, if he can start hitting those big booming punts more consistently, he'll have a chance to challenge Joe McGuire for the starting job in 2025, even though Joe McGuire is the incumbent starter. But I think a lot of that is going to depend on how Nick McLarty develops over the course of this offseason, which will be his first full offseason as a Buckeye after coming over from Australia. So you'd certainly expect some development there.
Yeah, and that's the thing with Nick is that consistency, and it's harder because he's so big and so tall, and it's why he can generate so much power on a ball. That's just physics. But at the same time, when you are generating that much power on all of your punts, those small miss hits that might not affect other punters as much, they get exaggerated, and that's something we've talked about with Nick in the past. You just finding that consistent strike of the ball, because the fact is, like, it's funny to be talking about a punter ceiling. It's not what you normally think about in football terms, but it's true. His ceiling is the highest of the punter room, even Anthony Veneri, right? And like, if he's figures that out, and if he's connecting consistently, you've got a guy who could totally flip field position and be a game changer on special teams. But he's got to figure out not only that consistency, but also like pooch punts. When you talk about pinning an offense deep from, midfield, a position where you don't have as much room for the punt and you don't want to boom it completely, you want to pin them. That's another part of like that consistent thing that Joe McGuire did a pretty good job of in some spots. The question is, can McLarty get to that same level? Because, man, the dude has a massive leg, and you'd like to see it, in action in some games, some 70-yard boots. But if you don't have that consistency, that's what's more important, because you can't afford to have a couple of those shanks in a game, and all of a sudden you're helping the opposing offense out with great field position. So that'll be, there's a lot of fun competitions to watch in this offseason for Ohio State. I think that's, again, part of the overall points of this episode is there's so much unknown with this team, but so much talent. It makes it exciting, and even punter is a microcosm of that.
I think overall, as we wrap up this conversation, you look at the talent across each of the positions on the roster, and you can see a lot of reasons for optimism with this Ohio State football team. Now, do I necessarily agree with the idea of Ohio State being, the national championship frontrunner, as the early betting odds say? I don't, because there's so much experience that's being replaced on this team. So many star players that Ohio State has to replace. But I think to call this team the national championship favorite again for next year right now, to me, I can't get there. I need to see. We're talking about a lot of guys that we think are going to be really good players, but I need to see them actually prove that they're really good players in real action before I can get to that point. And so I think what overall I look at this roster, I say this team has the potential to do anything next year. The potential is certainly there, but I do think it's a different kind of team, a different kind of season. We talked all last offseason about it being all in for a national championship, natty or bust, and anything less than that was going to be a disappointment. Of course, that's going to be the goal again. That's just the way it is in Columbus. You win one, you want to win another one. So, of course, that's going to be the goal and the expectation. And I think this roster is capable of getting there. I think we just kind of outlined all the talent that gives it that capability. But I also don't think that it should be viewed through the same lens as we viewed this team going into last year. Because I think last year it was like, this team is too good not to win the national championship. And if it doesn't win the national championship, something went wrong. And it almost did, but they got it back on track, and they came together and went on a legendary championship run and proved that they were a national championship caliber team all along. But I think with this team, I don't think we're going to know until we actually get into the season whether this is a national championship caliber team, because I just think there are so many players that they're going to be counting on who, whether it's playing a starting role for the first time in their career or, transferring in from somewhere else, making a jump in competition. If everything goes right, Ohio State could have the best roster in the country once again. But there's a lot of things that need to go right for Ohio State to get there.
I'm right there with you, Dan. I always think when there's this many unknowns on a team, any team, even when you have all the talent that Ohio State has, there's going to be some hiccups somewhere. There's going to be a position or two where they either struggle over early on and figure it out, or they struggle the entire year and it ends up like derailing maybe those championship ambitions. I do think, to your point, though, again, this roster has the talent to go win a national title, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I think when you talk about best receiver room in the country, like you said, potentially one of the best tight end rooms in the country. The offensive line, I think, has a lot of upside with the two transfer tackles. If Daniels can be that guy at right tackle, you really like where you're at on the interior. There's a lot of upside at quarterback, at running back, but it's a lot of pieces to click and get there. And I think particularly on the defensive side of the ball, replacing as much as is being replaced there, to be that national title caliber team. And you're right, it's going to be a different look than last year. You're going to have to figure a lot of things out early on in the season and establish that identity, and can't sleep on the fact that you're going to be bringing in a new defensive coordinator. I really think that people underestimate, even if it does end up being an internal promotion and it's Matt Guerrieri and he's going to run a very similar scheme to what Jim Knowles was running, it's still a new identity being forged for the defense, a new approach, a new just everything that takes time to sink in and click. And so regardless of who the new DC is, all the combination of that and all that you're replacing on that side of the ball, I think this defense, like how they adjust, how those pieces fit together, what you're doing with CJ Hicks, how good you are at nickel, if Lorenzo Styles is ready for. There's a lot of questions. The defensive tackle play, like there's a lot of questions with defense right now, especially, but the offense too, and how that clicks throughout the season is going to dictate where Ohio State can go. Because I am very confident there's going to be some early season hiccups with this team, because it's just so much newness and so much that you're having to rebuild, refresh, reload, whatever phrase you want to use, on both sides of the ball, really. But I think particularly on that defensive side without Jim Knowles.
Well, we'll have plenty of time to talk more about the 2025 Ohio State football team over the next 7 months before the Buckeyes return to action again. For now, we're out of time for this week, so I hope you join us again next week on Real Pod Wednesdays. Thanks for listening in.